Martin Luther King. And what was Martin Luther King talking about when he was assassinated? It wasn't the Civil Rights March on Washington in 1963.
Well, don't you all feel that we lost our government with the Kennedy assassination, that was it then for freedom as we know it?
I think we lost our government in 1947, but that's just my take.
With the NSA, maybe?
Yeah.
But
well, yeah, I think we lost it maybe just a slightly earlier. I think we as I've written before, we signed a pact with the devil when we brought the Nazis over and, welcomed them with open arms and said, all is forgiven. I think that we sold our soul at that point.
Who was the
I think it all went down the hill from there. I mean,
Peter, who was the we? Who brought them over?
Well, yeah, that's another good question. I mean, Truman signed presidential orders telling the Pentagon or telling the Department of the Army at that point that they could not bring over war criminals and have them, employed. And the Pentagon ignored him, basically, and brought them over. But the Pentagon was only one element of that. Industry brought them over as well. I mean, there was the nascent intelligence services wanted them. The OSS wanted what they could get out of them as well. The CIA in Western Europe was basically a Nazi operation under Reinhard Gehlen.
Yeah, so there were spy ring. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, all of this was everybody just jumped on the Nazi bandwagon at that point and said, let's bring them on over.
One person was at the center of that. Henry Kissinger. Years ago, I did a book with a guy who worked for J. Edgar Hoover. He was a mob guy. He was a wise guy because they didn't call them wise guys back in the 40s. That they were in the families, and he was in Operation Underworld in all the way back in 1942. Remember Operation Underworld? It was a real thing. Dewey right. And Luciano, and Luciano had been busted by Thomas Dewey and thrown in jail for, it was after everything Luciano did, right? He was thrown in jail on statutory rape, right? So right. He's in jail. He's in upstate New York. I think Greenhaven, all the way up in upstate New York. The Axis powers, mainly the Italians, were tipping off the Germans to our freighters sailing to Europe, obviously in convoys to resupply the British and etc. The Germans, the U-boats, knew the sailing schedules, so they had only to sit off the Atlantic coast and just torpedo the ships, just follow the ships out, torpedo them, and we were losing a lot of convoys, a lot of ships in convoys. We believed that there was a conspiracy among the Italians and the Longshoremen's Union, that there were spies in the Longshoremen's Union. So what Hoover and Dewey, and of course Wild Bill Donovan and Bill Casey, the OSS guys, did was they tried to structure a deal. We bring Luciano down from Greenhaven to Ossining, to Sing Sing, where he can enjoy the fruits of his millions, right? We bring in Meyer Lansky to arrange the deal. Meyer Lansky was very powerful. By then, he was in the Five Families, although he was never a made guy, right? And in so doing, Luciano gets pardoned, goes off to Sicily, where he helps Patton, by the way, subdue the island. But meanwhile, you have an operation on the New York waterfront. And so from those very early moments, you've got the mob, you've got they're fighting against the Axis powers, and you've got all the players in place for what would later be kind of this. So this guy was involved in Operation Underworld, and he said that one of the things that he was told, he's working for Hoover, that it was Henry Kissinger who brought a lot of these people over. The government supplied them with diplomatic plates, and one of the things this guy was doing was there would be key figures that Hoover would want taken out. He couldn't do it legally, so he had a group of, call them assassins, who were taking, they were contract hitters. They were from the mob that were, and the police. And I met another one of the guys who did, he's dead now, who was doing it. And these guys were contract hitters. And so there was a great story about Kissinger bringing the Nazis over and arranging a lot of these, like Kurt Waldheim, for example, erasing their records so that SS guys could be infiltrated in. And I'm wondering if you've come across any of those stories.
Well, I've come across, of course, the whole Luciano story is pretty well documented. It's pretty well known. The involvement of Dulles, the involvement of Nixon in some of this is also documented. Nixon's one of his first jobs after the end of the war was in Washington, D.C., going through the naval intelligence files, which is how he met Dulles. I mean, the whole thing is very mysterious about 1945, 1946, and Nixon's lifetime. So, and of course, Nixon was Kissinger's best friend, right? I mean, that was a match made in hell, So, I don't see anything about that story that would seem unusual or unreal to me. I think that Kissinger, in particular, showed himself to be an extremely pragmatic person. I mean, he was definitely involved in real politics as opposed to anything else. So, I don't see Kissinger as any kind of moral person in this regard, or somebody who would not deal with Nazis if he thought that he would get some benefit out of it. So it would not surprise me. I mean, on the basis of everything else that I've gone through, it's the least surprising aspect of it. In fact, I've been working on another story in the last 6 months or so involving the fact that Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, at one point had hired Walter Rauff, the SS officer who invented the mobile gas vans before the actual crematoria and gas chambers were invented by the Nazis. He invented this van where you would put the exhaust into the back of the van, drive around with people in the back until they died. Walter Rauff was very high up in the food chain in Nazi Germany. He knew Alan Dulles personally, and then he winds up working first for American intelligence briefly, and then for Israeli intelligence because of his deep connections with Egypt, with the Egyptian security forces. So, at that level, everybody's dealing with everyone else. The outrage that you or I might feel having Israel, for instance, knowingly work with war criminals, people who were responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Jews, that they would willingly employ the guy, pay him to find out what was going on in Egypt. I mean, if we understand that that's what really is going on, if we can understand just that story, get our head around that, and understand that that is what really was going on, then we can suddenly sit back and say, okay, there is another reality out there. There is a whole other... Yeah, go on.
And then you have to wrap your brain around the fact that all these connections are being made at the same time. Both the United States and Israel are looking for Yosef Mengele, who's on the run through South America, as well as a bunch of other Nazis. But Mengele in particular, they're both looking for him, while the United States government takes all the files from the concentration camps, from Dornberger's experiments, from Dornberger, was it Peenemünde, but from his material, from the actual medical records at the concentration camps, for all the experiments on twins, the experiments in like putting people in ice cold water, from all the space tests. The Germans tried to put men in space. I was at one of their space facilities when we did UFO Hunters, and they were doing that. And so you've got this almost multiple personality among our own governments. You're looking for Mengele, but you're using his experiments. You are trying war criminals at Nuremberg, yet Werner von Braun, Kurt Debus, Dornberger are all happily enjoying new lives in America, while they're double agents sending material back to their counterparts in the Soviet Union because they have a higher belief. They're all SS. So they have a higher belief in the whole cult of Nazism itself, which has occultist roots going back to the 19th century.
Well, sure. I mean, as I've said so many times, if we are distracted by the idea that there was a Nazi party, as if it was a regular political party, and it wasn't. The Nazi party was a cult. It was a cult from beginning to end. And they don't give up. If you lose most countries, if they fight a war, they lose a war, okay, they lost. I mean, it's over. Maybe they'll regroup at some later time and fight again. But the Nazis didn't lose. From their point of view, the war went on. I mean, it was just a change of venue. I mean, you had
right.
a lot of the SS moved to the Middle East and conducted operations there. Alois Brunner may still be alive in Syria. Walter Rauff was operating there. I mean, Nasser hired so many hundreds of Nazi SS officers and people that scientists and everything else to develop his rocket programs. And then you had them all over Latin America. You had Klaus Barbie running Secret Service in Bolivia, the official Secret Service. I mean, they just changed. Changed venue. That's all. They continued the fight.
A German Gestapo and SS personnel went to the Middle East as the war was ending.
But what was their goal?
And the Caliph of Jerusalem was basically, dealing with SS.
But what would be their goal, the Nazi goal, the Iron Sky kind of goal? Is a cartoon movie right now that talks about this. What is the goal of these people if Hitler's gone, if the German economy is okay, if those are the two reasons supposedly for Hitler's rise. If those two things are taken away, what are Nazis?
Well, the Nazi raison d'etre, I mean, the whole motivating force, if we look back at the war, we look how in the last 2 years especially Germany was losing the war. I mean, they were suffering terrible losses. And yet, until the very last days of that regime, they kept the concentration camps running with a tremendous cost to the government, to the Third Reich. They kept those things going on. They kept the deaths taking place. There was a different motivation. It wasn't a purely practical motivation. Of course, there was economical reasons for the war. As you mentioned, Germany's okay now, so who cares? But actually, their plan was much broader than that. I mean, there's still the question of Lebensraum. There's still a question of living room and space for their people at the expense of others. This theology, this idea does not go away. It's not easily killed. And they kept up those beliefs. I mean, the ones that I've spoken with were proud of their role during the war.
And why were they so interested in the occult?
Well, for the same reasons, I think that you had tantric kings in Java. It was a question of power. This was the access to power. They believed that there were hidden sources of energy, hidden sources of power. They believed that, again, reality could be manipulated. Himmler, in particular, was a true believer in this. A book just came out recently by someone who discusses the fact that Himmler walked around with a copy of the Bhagavad Gita and books on yoga with him all the time and kept reading them, translated from Sanskrit. I mean, he really believed that there's a technology. There's a technology at the root of Tantra, at the root of occultism, at the root of the secret society initiations around the world, the root of shamanism. There's a technology at the root of it. It's a technology involving biology, chemistry, psychology, all of these things that we consider are parts of spirituality. There's an actual process. There are tools. And I think that this is what attracted the Nazis. It attracted people, emperors in Europe who were involved in alchemical experiments. All of this.
Well, did they get involved in any kind of mind-altering drugs, the Nazis?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we went. They were involved in psilocybin experimentation. They were involved in marijuana experimentation. The captured German documents that you can find at the archives in D.C. as well as in Germany showed that they were experimenting with mind-altering drugs during the war. Their interest in them was to use them, for questioning, as truth serums and that sort of thing. There was a tremendous interest in truth serum, but of course there were other uses as well. One of the famous Nazi doctors came to our country, Hubertus Struckhold, and ran our aviation medicine operation out of Randolph Air Force Base in Texas. Here was a man with a lot of blood on his hands, which got sort of dried up and swept under the rug. But the guy was responsible for terrible experiments in the camps during the war, and we embraced him because of his knowledge of aviation medicine, quote unquote. And that was an umbrella term for a lot of hideous stuff. It wasn't just altitude and all that. It was mind control things as well. Because when you're sending pilots up into space at high altitudes, they were looking for what kind of drugs would alter their consciousness, keep them alert, keep them from passing out, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of stuff involved with aviation medicine that impinges on the mind